Would you like to visit the world of John Wick with all the posturing and almost none of the fighting? Then I've got the show for you. Was that the pitch? It seems like that was the pitch. I can't believe that they were making this show and they weren't like, I think we don't have enough fighting. There is like no fighting on this show. Like there's like, I'll just tell you up front, there's like kind of a big fight to kick things off and you're like, oh, is this the way the show is going to be? And they're like, no, this is just to tide you over until all the way at night 3, episode 3, where we kind of have some fighting, but it's certainly not the level of John Wick. And you're like, but that was the assignment. That's like the only thing that you really had to do was have lots of cool fighting sequences. And they were like, fighting is expensive, I guess. And I'm like, I don't know. I've seen, 8711 or whatever the name of the company is of Chad Stahelski and David Leitch. They're churning out this stuff all the time, like bastard versions of John Wick on the cheap. But I guess it wasn't cheap enough for Peacock. But I mean, I was surprised, especially because the trailer made it seem like it had a lot of cool action. But that was most of the action and a much better edited trailer than the actual show, which is so slow. All right, so the Continental, for those of you who Peacock has not reached, it's on Peacock, which I have to tell you, has some good shows and is the best best streaming service for ads. I actually enjoy the ads on Peacock. But anyway, it's a John Wick prequel, and it shows how Winston became the head of the Continental. And interestingly, this was a nice little bonus, how he met Charon, aka the hotel concierge. And it's more complex than you would think because they have to fill 3 nights. This was really, then they should have just made one movie, quite frankly, one night. All right, so now if you've seen, also speaking of Charon, if you've seen John Wick 4, it's kind of sad knowing where Charon's path ultimately leads within this world. And of course, Lance Reddick himself tragically recently passed away. But his character didn't get a cool death. So, it's hard to kind of, there's a big question here as to whether or not Charon should stay at the Continental. And I was like, leave. It does not work out for you. All right, I was very upset with the way they killed his character in John. If you haven't seen John Wick 4 by now and you're watching a Continental review, that's on you. It was crazy that they killed his character off that way. All right, so the Continental is a 3-night event, but not 3 nights in a row. And I don't even think that would have worked, to be honest with you. But it's 3 Fridays in a row. And each episode is like about an hour and a half. So I think the idea is that for 3 Fridays in a row, you get a little John Wick movie. Because, John Wick 4 was 3 hours, 3 hours plus. Whereas these are like, episode 1's about an hour and 25. Episode 2 is just a touch over an hour. And then episode 3 is like a good hour and 45 minutes. Now, if I were you, though, I would really only tune in for night 3 on October 6th, because I wouldn't even say good. I think good is too strong of a word, but that's the only episode that I feel is acceptable and worth your time. Now, you might be a completionist. I get you. I like to, if I'm going to watch something, I'm like, okay, let's see the whole thing. But you're going to regret that decision because the first 2 episodes are a slog. I watch them in a day, and that's actually how I would recommend doing it. Just turn it into a John Wick 4 length movie, because when you put them all together, you basically have the length of John Wick 4. It'll be tough to get through it, but I mean, if I even had broken it up into 2 nights, if I wasn't reviewing it, I don't know if I would have come back to see episode 3, even though, again, as I said, that was the best of the bunch. Although it's pretty slow these days, you might not be able to wait, and you might give this show a whirl anyway, because there's just not a lot on. All right, so what's wrong with it? Let's talk about it. All right, hardly like some of you might feel some of these are spoilers, but there's just so many surprises in here. There are, particularly in episode 3, and I'm not going to spoil any of them, so don't worry about that. All right, now when you think of John Wick, what do you think of besides obviously Mr. Keanu Reeves? And that's the million-dollar question these days for Lionsgate and the people who make John Wick, because they're wondering if this franchise can survive without Keanu Reeves, who it was recently revealed has been begging them to kill him off, which I guess is why they ended John Wick 4 the way they did. And even still, they're like, maybe not. But Keanu Reeves apparently is like, I cannot physically do this anymore. So, Ana de Armas is going to take over as the ballerina, and Keanu Reeves is rumored to show up there briefly. No little John Wick shows up here or anything like that. Not even like John Wick's father or some Wick relation. He's not at all on the radar here. We'll talk about that they needed a John Wick style character anyway. But, you know, can this franchise be Keanu-less? And I have to tell you, this was my closing statement, but I'll just say it now. This show kind of convinced me that it can, but not this way. This was kind of like everything. This is like a test, and the result is what not to do with this property. You're like, okay, I do see a future for it, but back up and go down a different road, because this was not good. All right, so when you think of John Wick, you think of many extended action sequences, emphasis on many, which are each works of art, often with their own theme. Add to that ornate, colorful, and slick production design, and of course, the mythology of a league of gentlemen assassins who find refuge, and sometimes not, in the Continental, which we find out is a global chain of hotels. Here they just focus on New York. And with the high table overlooking it all, exacting a high price for imposing order. But as we've learned from the movies, Winston, Charon, and John Wick aren't big on following rules. And, you know, you can see that with Winston and Charon here. Now, the mythology is the only thing that this show gets right. And even then, things don't really click until that third episode when they start to really explore the Continental and start to add to the mythology. Until then, you're kind of like, nah, like, there's way too much backstory. It just takes so long. You're like, let's speed this up, man. The ending is solid. It introduced me to the Kiss song. I can't believe I've never heard it before, being a New Yorker, New York Groove. I mean, I'm surprised that I Make That Love a Kiss song. Never been my group, never been a group for me, but I've been listening to this song nonstop since I heard it last night at the very, very end. I was like, oh, I love it. And as I've told you many times before, if you're going to stick anything, stick the landing, because that's what people remember as they walk away from your movie or television show. However, in this case, you're assuming they get to night 3, episode 3. But I thought the ending was solid. I was like, my God, that was not bad, even though I had such a bad time watching the rest of it. I mean, they kind of got me at the very, very end. But again, if I had not been reviewing the show, it's very slow. I've watched some things. I was like I remember a friend of mine teased me, and she was like, you're the only one still watching Boardwalk Empire. And I'm like, I need to see how it ends. So, I mean, are you like that? Now, if they do bring back the Continental for a second season, which they clearly like to do, and I can't believe it, I would vote for. But I vote with an asterisk, because I have a very long list, well, not long, but an emphatic list of things that clearly need to change. First off, with all due respect to director Albert Hughes, who's done some solid, respectable movies, and that he directs the first and third episode, and Charlotte Brandstrom, who's done a smattering of TV, mostly The Lord of the Rings. Those are okay directed. I only watched 1 or 2 of them, but still, they're just not a match with the material. They don't have Chad Stahelski's inventiveness or love for what they're doing, either for setting up the fights or how to film them. And as you might recall, we discussed this in my John Wick coverage, Chad Stahelski carries around a journal where he jots down ideas for fight scenes as they occur to him in life, as he's just living his life. He's like, oh, that would be cool. And this show is missing that dedication to action and stunts as an art form. It's very by the numbers, which is disappointing because that's, of course, one of John Wick's calling cards. There's an extended opening fight sequence that, as I said, that is acceptable, and it makes you feel like maybe it's setting the tone, maybe we're just getting warmed up, but it ends up really being mostly to hold you over until episode 3. And also that opening, it came across to me as like a really well-made fan film than as something that actually came from the John Wick franchise, from the production design to the people who were cast, both as the actors and the extras and the fighters, to the way it was filmed. It seemed very much like a fan film, but again, like a surprisingly good one. But it never crossed over into like professional. There's one fight that I thought was pretty good, that was inventive, and I thought was worthy of being a John Wick franchise fight, and that is in episode 3. And look for the phone booth fight, which I think was interesting because they have to fight in a contained space. That was very cool. I really like that fight a lot. All right, now on that note, the fighters themselves, as I said, are not particularly good, which is weird because Stahelski and Leach come from a stunt background and they should have access to a lot of really great fighters, and they certainly do for their feature film work, but here, not the case. The best fighters, interestingly, though, are women, and I wonder how people are going to react to that. Jessica Elaine and Nung Kate. Both women are the only fighters who get even close to the level of John Wick, of the fighters in the John Wick movies. And they do their best despite not being given John Wick level fights. Although one of them has that phone booth fight, and that was cool. I don't want to ruin it for you, but I thought that was a cool fight. At the very least, you can like fast forward to go to episode 3 and find that fight. The twin assassins, Hansel and Gretel, at first seemed very promising. I actually liked them in the trailer. They were one of the things that made me feel the show would be good. But then they never totally deliver. Like, the idea of a contortionist martial artist is extremely clever. And that's only one of them, by the way. But I was like, what a great idea. But they never really do very much with that, which I was disappointed with. I would say the Continental is resting at a 5, and it never gets above a 7, which again is weird for a franchise that's known for always being at an 11. The casting and production design do not help either. So we'll start with production design. It's very weak, more horror film than John Wick. Is this the Continental or the Hollywood Tower Hotel? With New York City in the 1970s being used as an excuse to make everything look cheap and dirty, whereas in the John Wick movies, everything looks slick and polished. Also, everything looks the same. All the action sequences and all the settings are pretty much the same. They adjust them a little bit for neighborhoods around downtown New York, but for the most part, it always seems like you're in the same environment. Whereas in the John Wick movies, especially as they've progressed, they're constantly changing things up with inventive locations, lighting, etc. And they don't do that here. I also don't think the score was particularly good either, and I love the John Wick scores. Okay, finally, let's talk casting. Now, the big swing here is Mel Gibson, who seems to be trying to play Joe Pesci. I was like, weird. Why would Mel Gibson want to be Joe Pesci? He's fine, but at no point was I wondering if this was beneath Mel Gibson. I was like, well, he seems where he's supposed to be. A big problem with the show by far is that Colin Woodell is simply no Ian McShane. I'm like, there's no way that guy grows up to be Ian McShane. And on the same note, Eomid Adigun is simply no Lance Reddick. Again, rest in peace, Lance Reddick. Those are were potent character actors. And so now that their characters are leads, suddenly the franchise switches to bland actors to play them? I mean, that's just crazy. I mean, like, I'll just say Ian McShane wore the cravat, whereas the cravat wears Colin Woodell. It is sort of interesting, though, to see Winston begin to assemble all the connections we see him have years later when he's working with John Wick. And again, in episode 3, there are some good surprises and developments in particular. But the first 2 episodes, as I said, are a real slog with just, again, too much backstory for too many characters. And they're not even red shirts. Okay, so anyway, I'm like, this is crazy. Only Katie McGrath, as a representative of the high table, gets the tone right. She understood the assignment. She is suitably bizarre, but her role is too small. I was like, this is kind of interesting. And they're like, okay, we're not going to use it very much. And I'm like, whatever. Also, we're missing a John Wick, a super assassin to be a good soldier for Winston and Charon, who are the brains of the operation. I guess maybe it's supposed to be Nung Kate, or maybe brother and sister dojo gunrunners, Jessica Elaine and Hubert Point du Jour. But then they have so many other people joining the group in addition to those that the group becomes too big and unwieldy. You're like, they're putting together a team, but it's a real ragtag team, and they just can't successfully build up or sell any of them to the audience. You know, nobody is the new John Wick or the John Wick for this prequel, and that was a really important thing to do. I did think that Ray McKinnon of the ragtag group did manage to make, he had an interesting kind of like his B storyline was kind of interesting. I was like, oh, I kind of totally saw where it was going, but it did get to me. So I thought that, he managed to do a pretty good job. The other stuff seemed so cliche that even though the actors tried very hard, it was tough for them. Speaking of B storylines, there's another one about an NYPD detective who's pursuing them, but with her own mysterious agenda. That's really, I think, the B storyline. I guess the Ray McKinnon stuff is like the C storyline, but everybody, there's so many like storylines. They got like almost, I would say, A through Z, and that's too many storylines. You're supposed to really only have A and B. Maybe sometimes you can have a C. But I guess, and again, they all felt like they were story extenders, because they were like, how are we going to fill 3 episodes? And I'm like, you can't. Cut down the number of episodes. You don't have 3 episodes worth of material here, at least not what you've presented me. All right, so back to the NYPD detective. They do have the reveal in episode 3, and it turned out to be mildly interesting, but not to warrant all the time that we spent on it. Michelle Prada is okay as that detective, while Jeremy Bobb, who I loved on The Nick, I was like, oh, is it that guy from The Nick? But then he ended up just doing a cheap David Harbour impression as another detective. I was like, you clearly told him to just do David Harbour. So that's one of the things I think also added it to seeming like a fan film. So basically, the show ended up, as I said, convincing me that a Continental show actually would work, but they just went about it totally the wrong way. So I would recommend this to hardcore John Wick fans who simply will have to see it for themselves. Martial arts movie junkies who will just enjoy whatever fighting they can get, and then you can critique it, Or if you're bored, which, it's, as I said, it's slow right now. So that might be you. So that's my review of the Continental, which starts its weekly 3-night event on Peacock this Friday. Share your thoughts down below, subscribe today, and of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.